Founded by German-speaking immigrants, the Lake View neighborhood in Chicago has gone through many metamorphoses over almost 200 years. But faith has always played a role in this dynamic streetscape with Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims, all living and worshiping here. For more on the role of faith in Lakeview's history, let's welcome Matt Nickerson, whose new book, East Lakeview, chronicles the area's history in photographs. We also welcome Reverend Douglas Strome, pastor of Lake View Presbyterian Church, which has stood on the corner of Addison and Broadway since 1888. And we welcome Charlotte Lill, a longtime member of Broadway United Methodist Church, which was founded in 1891. Give us a brief history of this area in this neighborhood in Chicago.
Well, it began with the Lake View House Resort in 1854. It was a summer resort for Chicagoans to escape the heat. And inland, it was German farmers, and it evolved from farmland to suburb to a blue-collar immigrant neighborhood to what it is today, which is a white-collar neighborhood of people not from many countries, but from many states. And
what was the most surprising piece of history that you found while researching for this book?
Well, one of them is that Lakeview was so church heavy. You know, they call Wheaton the city of churches. I don't know if anyone called Lakeview the neighborhood of churches, but they could. There's twin Bible belts running up and down Broadway. So in the block east of Broadway, in a 6-block stretch, you have each of the Jewish faith, conservative, reform, and Orthodox. And in the block west of Broadway, in the same 6-block stretch, you have 5 Protestant mainline denominations: Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Unitarian, and Church of Christ. And you go out a little further west, you have every Swedish or German Lutheran church you could ever want to find. So it's actually a faith-packed neighborhood. Not to mention, of course, being Chicago, a big, gigantic Catholic church smack in the middle, Mount Carmel and Belmont.
So, Reverend Joy, Lakeview Presbyterian Church, one of the oldest buildings or institutions operating in the same building, is that right?
Well, we think so, and I think it has to do with the fact that our building was designed and built by Burnham and Root, so we have that little claim to fame. But the congregation was actually formed in 1884. They met in the town hall for the first 4 years while they were getting funds together to build our building. And in 1888, the building was created. So the congregation was started 4 years before that. So.
And Charlotte, Broadway United Methodist has a long history too, but not in the same building, right? It burned down?
It seemed to have, well, first of all, I think the original started in the late 1800s also. That must have been a decade of, or at least a short period, because I think Mount Carmel and our church, the Presbyterian Church, was all within a 5-year period. But I think they started meeting over on Halsted Street before they actually came to that corner. Yes, and then of course we were in 1891. The structure was built, and then we did have a major fire in 1983. I always have to think. Anyway, yes, it didn't burn completely down, but enough that we had to take it down.
And Joy, just looking through some of the most wonderful pictures in this book, it talks about the Lakeview women's basketball team. So this dates back to the 1920s. Tell us about that.
So next to our building, like adjacent completely, is a parish house that was not designed by Burnham and Root, but was built in 1911, and it really functioned a lot like a neighborhood house. Many of the other neighborhood houses in Chicago, and there were classes for immigrants on all kinds of topics. They had a theater group and a basketball league amongst churches, I believe, because the caption in that picture of our women's basketball team in 1924, I believe, says that they were like winners of something that day, that year. And that's one of my favorite photos, because I just can't picture in our little gymnasium that they would have set aside space for women's basketball. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Charlotte, tell us how you think history plays a role in what the church is today.
If we are faithful to our challenge of ministering to the neighborhood, I think we have to change. Who we were when I started 51 years ago is not the same church that it is today, because the neighborhood has changed a lot, and we feel called to minister to the neighborhood. As the neighborhood became the gay influence in the neighborhood, we felt a call to really minister to the gays. Our welcoming statement is a very different welcoming statement in that we every Sunday name by name every part of the gay community as we can, and call it by name. And folks have said that as they entered the church, maybe they were fearful of re-entering a church where they perhaps had been rejected or abused. They have never felt that they could sit in a church and hear who they were and be welcomed as that person. And we met the challenge of having holy unions before people wanted to talk about it. I'm sure our church was in the news a good deal about 17 years ago when our pastor would not back down and do that, back down away from his calling to minister to all.
Yeah, and so Matt, when you were doing the research and you see what the neighborhood is today, what did you see that has changed?
Well, one thing I noticed was, particularly with the Protestant denominations, since we have a couple of Protestants here, is it's really a comeback story. I mean, a lot of those mainline Protestant denominations, well, they're thriving at the turn of the century. It's no coincidence that Lake View Presbyterian was founded in 1888. East Lakeview along Lakeshore Drive was very affluent, and affluent Americans at that time were generally members of mainline Protestant denominations. Well, as a neighborhood filled up with Swedes and Germans who were Lutheran or perhaps Catholic, the Protestants shriveled up, no fault of the churches. The demographics simply changed, and by the 70s, the neighborhood getting rougher. You had neighbor churches like the Unitarians who were shriveled down to, a dozen members, and I think Lake View Presbyterian only had a few dozen. But since the 70s and 80s, they've had kind of a comeback story. I mean, just having gone to the churches, the Unitarian church has filled up, the Presbyterians have filled up. Broadway Methodist had its resurrection from the fire like a phoenix. So I would say it's kind of it was a roller coaster ride from great heights to depths and now up again.
Joyce, so how has your church changed through the times and in addressing the current culture in Lakeview?
Well, I would agree with what Charlotte said, that paying attention to those changes in the neighborhood are what makes a church vital, and what actually feeds people's needs in the neighborhood. And so we've seen very many of the similar changes that he was talking about from the very beginning, working with immigrant people in the neighborhood, to the shift to when the neighborhood kind of tanked. We started a bunch of social programs. We had a thrift shop. We had an alternative high school for 47 years, and we had a senior citizen lunch program. Then as the neighborhood began shifting again, a couple of those have fallen off. We don't need those so much anymore because there's so many different other activities in the neighborhood that meet those same needs. We still have our senior citizen lunch program. It's going strong. So, and we've added some new things now that families are so much more prominent in Lakeview. So we have some family programming that's really popular right now in our church. So definitely paying attention to what's going on around you and responding and being flexible enough to shift programming when you need to, I think was a big part of how we were able to rebound a bit.
And we've done the same. We have a dinner program twice a month for Lakeview youth. Lakeview has always sort of been a center for gathering of homeless or youth that don't feel accepted at home. They're in between teens and young adults, and we started a youth program having dinner, and they can just hang out. There are activities for them to participate in. Sometimes they just come in and sleep because they're tired from walking the streets.
Joy, tell us a little bit about the immigrant history that you are aware of.
Well, I know that all of our churches kind of drew from the same kind of populations, but I like to think that, I don't know how it is at the other churches, but at our church, rarely do we have anybody join our church who is actually from Chicago. So I kind of think we are still all immigrants from somewhere. And so that idea of welcoming immigrants is such a hot topic right now, but it is so important in what makes the neighborhood really thriving and diverse and more interesting than a homogeneous area that never has anybody that everybody's from the same place. So we're all immigrants. That's the main thing.
It's very culturally rich.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Matt, Joy, and Charlotte, for joining us and sharing a little bit about Lakeview's history. We appreciate it. I'm Anne Marie Gerhardt for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.